Hi, this is the Social Jello with Angelo show. My name's Angelo. I'm a social scientist, surfer, martial artist, and a whole lot of other things. Coming to you live from Kasai City, Japan, the Social Jello with Angelo show.
What's up? And welcome to another episode of Social Jello with Angelo, Conversations with a Backfist. Apologies ahead of time. I'm wearing a green shirt. I have a green screen in the background, so my shirt's gonna flash in and out black. So for anybody watching, I'm a professional and I know better than to wear green, but I did it anyway. So there is. I'm here with Larry Gordon. Larry Gordon is a Kajukenbo black belt, and full disclosure, he comes from my circle of Kajukenbo guys. So I'm not biased or anything, but I do like to try to get some of the people I trained with on the show, and this was one of those rare opportunities where I get to do that. A little bit of a background. So this is gonna be a little bit different episode for anybody watching. Normally I interview people I've never met and I have no idea what their background is. But for Larry, I call him coach, even though Larry jumped into Kajukenbo later in my journey. I was already Larry. What was I? Was I a purple belt, a blue belt when you got there? I forgot. Brown belt.
I think you were purple and you tested for your blue the same time I was a white belt because Ronnie and I just joined Professor Ronnie with Josh and Corey. And of course, I had martial arts training for off and on for many years throughout my life. So you tested for your blue belt the day we were white belts and we all tested together.
Okay, so I was a blue. I tested for blue, and Larry had a wrestling background, so he's the one who brought in a lot of the grappling. We had some grappling before Larry showed up. I call him Seafood Professor. He knows how I am with titles. Bad, but he's a professor now. He had a little bit of background in judo, so we had a few judo throws. But once Larry came in, we started doing going over double legs, single legs, because he coaches wrestling. So that's how I met Larry. Now, what we're gonna do for all of you that have never met Larry, we're gonna start going back. So that's why. So I normally don't introduce my guests this way, but Larry gets a special introduction.
All right.
so going into the past though. So Larry, I know you've mentioned before you had a different, and I know we've talked about this off camera. But let's just start from the very, very, very beginning. What's the first martial art? And I include wrestling in this. I know some people
Yeah.
think martial arts, they only see it as people wearing gis, but I include anything that includes any type of fighting or grappling, even if it's sport oriented. What's the first martial art that you started training in?
So back in the kind of mid to late 60s, my first martial arts that I began training in was Tang Soo Do, down in La Mesa, California. I trained there in the fifth and sixth grade. When I was in elementary school, a lot of the kids that I went to school with, a lot of kids, dads were law enforcement, were military, so boxing was a big thing. And I never really got into the boxing thing of it, but back in the day, everybody scrapped. You were always fighting. So when I held my own, but I got beat up a lot. But I wasn't really interested in boxing. So my mom actually somehow through a friend, she met a guy that had just opened a studio. And to be honest with you, he's literally I think he's the only instructors whose name I literally cannot remember to this day now. But he was a really cool guy. But I trained under him. I went from white belt just to a yellow belt. I trained with him for about a year and a half, I think, almost through the seventh grade, and then I moved from living with my mom and came to Escondido and moved in with my dad, and then I didn't really train much again until my late teens, early 20s, and then I got into the American Taekwondo Association, where they had a store, or they had a studio in Escondido, and I trained under what was he? He was I believe he was ninth Dan at the time. His name was Chuck Hawkins. He's the one that ran the store, and then of course he brought in several instructors while I trained there. I hold a yellow belt in Tang Soo Do, and I hold a blue belt, 3 red stripes in Taekwondo. Then I quit, and I didn't train a lot, but I did a lot of. I got back into wrestling. That's one thing I forgot too. As a kid, my first real combat training was in wrestling when I trained. My uncle originally was a wrestler, and some of his friends that I knew back in La Mesa back in the day, they had a wrestling club that we would go learn, that we would train in. And then when I moved to Escondido, I joined the wrestling team that we had at junior high school here at Orange Glen Junior High under Coach Maynard. So I was involved in wrestling, and then off and on through martial arts, pretty much through the rest of my life. Like I said, then I got into about my mid-20s. I stopped training in Taekwondo, got back into wrestling and grappling and doing some, kind of backyard fighting kind of stuff, and of course, your typical mid-20s life running amok on you. So, and then of course, I really got back into the wrestling scene when Josh and Corey got of age and got into middle school and into high school, and wanted to know like what they should start doing for sports. And of course, the first thing I told them was go out for wrestling. And within Josh's first year, I had talked to a few of his coaches. They found out some of my background, and I was asked to come up and start just kind of being a walk-in coach, kind of helping the kids. Started attending practices, and lo and behold, here I am now 22 years later coaching high school wrestling. And it's kind of where I'm at now. I met you guys in around 2007, and that's when I found out about Kajukenbo. And of course, after joining Kajukenbo, and training with you guys and all the people that we've met, through the Abad system, and Alan and his family, and meeting the Kinjis, and the martial arts experience I've had since then has always left me wishing I would have found Kajukenbo way back in the 70s. You know what I mean?
So let's rewind here a little bit.
Sure.
I want, because I know a lot about your background, but one thing I don't know, and maybe you can answer this. So you said your uncle ran a wrestling club. How old were you when this happened?
I was grade school.
Grade school. So you're elementary?
3rd, 4th, 5th grade, yeah. And
Okay,
then yeah.
do you remember what style of wrestling they were doing?
At the time, I was learning folk style and freestyle, and then of course, freestyle. I don't really remember when folk style came into being. I know my first experience with straight folk style wrestling was when I joined the wrestling team when I moved up here to Escondido it was junior high school when I was in school. It is now what they call middle school. And we actually had wrestling PE, and then the school I attended at Orange Glen, which is now Orange Glen Elementary, but when it was Orange Glen Junior High, Coach Maynard, we held a wrestling tournament inside the school at the end of the year, and then we also had meets against. At the time, we wrestled against Del Dios, and we wrestled against Grant Junior High School, which is now Mission Middle School, and ourselves. And then at the end of the can't remember, I think it was like 8 weeks of PE, we had our own wrestling tournament.
Grant Middle School is where I got jumped for the first time.
Yeah,
and then Del Dios was the school that I ended up at, and I ended up after I got jumped. I've told this story before. That's how I ended up getting into martial arts, and then later I ended up getting transferred over to Del Dios because Del Dios, by the time I came around, that's where they sent all the bad kids. So like if you got
Yeah.
kicked out of every other middle school, like didn't matter if you were in our town or not, kids that got kicked out from
Uh-huh.
San Marcos would end up in Del Dios. It was like the last place they went to before they moved them over to juvie. So like,
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's still kind of got that reputation.
so so like he's mentioning these schools. These are not. I don't know how it was back then, but was it they were the same back then, or are they a little bit better?
So yeah, that side. So basically, your side of town was like that was where that was the bad side of town. The west side's always been the west side, brother. Even back in the early 70s.
I was
But what's
wondering.
funny is I was from the Orange Glen side of town, cross town from you guys, and of course we were, 90% middle class, white, whites. You had a few of the Hispanics, and very, very minimal of the other races. Of course, now it's funny because I've lived in Escondido for the most part 50 something years now, and I've seen the dynamic change now. Your guys' side of town is becoming more the middle class, your average family, and my side of town in Orange Glen is now where everybody goes when they can't be anywhere else, and they're the ghetto. You know,
So weird.
and
Yeah, no.
Escondido High School, that used to be where all the problems were, is now like we're the better of the three schools in Escondido.
Oh man.
So
So for anyone listening, let me catch you up here because I don't want this to turn into like an inside. We don't know what the fuck these guys are talking about in this inside
yeah,
conversation. So Escondido is located in San Diego. It's part of North County, San Diego. So San Diego City is closer to the border. If you go a little more north, 30 minutes out of the city, you have this area called North San Diego, and that's where Escondido is located. Um, so I'm thinking about all this. You mentioned folk style wrestling, and I like to break down the different rules of different martial arts for people who don't follow that style. And
mhm.
I've heard this story before, but I'd rather hear it from you. You mentioned folk style wrestling. What are the rules of folk style wrestling?
Well, so I'll give you the first, I know probably a good majority of our Kajukenbo Ohana, and all over your podcast, and obviously it's all over the world. Everybody knows there's three styles of wrestling. You have your Roman Greco, you have your freestyle, which is what you see in the Olympics. Okay, along with the Greco Roman. Folk style is all you see in the United States. That was America's version because, and there's a lot of pros and cons about it. It's not recognized in the international scope of wrestling. It's literally only used in the United States, although many of your Olympic champions and your world champions and all, they come from a folk style background. It's basically so folk style. One of the biggest differences, one of the first biggest rules you'll see is you cannot lock hands. In freestyle, you are allowed to lock your hands at any time. That's how you do turns, takedowns, everything. In folk style, you have to, upon getting a takedown, you have to literally immediately go from a hand lock position, or however, whether it's fingers or the butterfly grip. You have to go from there to here. You have to immediately let go. As soon as you touch the mat, you have to let go of your hands. You cannot it you have to move side to side. You cannot stay in one position for very long. You get called for stalling. There's action. It's freestyle has action too. They want constant movement. Basically what happens though with folk style, they will penalize you if you're in a stalling position. You get two warnings, and then you give up a stalling call, you get an extra point. In freestyle, if you do not continue action in 3 to 5 seconds, they will stop action. They stand you back up into a neutral position and you start over. And if you constantly get caught in a what they call it's like a stalling position, or what they call passivity position, you're not pushing the subject, they'll warn you. And if they warn you twice, the other guy gets a point. So they want to see constant, movement. Then there's the scoring. The scoring is different. In freestyle, rolling your opponent across his back scores you points. Rolling an opponent across your back in folk style will not score you points. You have to hold them in a position with their back exposed in order to start getting what they call near fall points or back points. From what I understand, I guess the scoring is actually changing a bunch this year at the college level and high school level. And I actually haven't gotten the newer ones, but you take a guy to his back and hold him in a position there for more than a 2 count, where the referee will wave his hands in a 2 count. You get an extra point on top of the 2 points. Now, if you hold him exposed for more than, I believe it's a 3 count, you get what's called an exposure point. So now you can get up to 4 points. And if you get a count of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from the referee, you get a total of 5 points. So whereas before you would get a 5 count would get you a 3 near fall points. Any exposure and a hand swipe would get you 2 points. Now there's an exposure point where you can actually score an extra point. And so you could actually even come out of there scoring 6 points.
So once you hit the 6 points, you win, or is it one of those things where you
you have
to
accumulate
win the points and you get the
you keep going until wins. In folk style, the match is over when it's called a tech fall. If you get to 15 points ahead, there is if you beat somebody by 1 point to 5 points, it's considered a minor. If you get 6 points or 5 points or over, it's a major. And then this goes towards the team point scoring is all it does, is where it's mostly used at. And then, of course, if you get 8 points or more, that's considered a major decision. And then, of course, pin is the most points. That gets you 6 points. Tech fall is 5 points. Major is 4 points, and then the rest is 3 points.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, and how long are the matches?
They are three. In high school, it's 3 2-minute periods. From the blow of the referee. Each period is started with a coin toss, or a number draw or whatever. And then so you start out neutral on your feet. The second period is started. You get your choice depending on if you win your toss or not. You can start out in a referee's position, down position, where basically, for sake of just being quick about it, you're on your hands and knees. And then the other wrestler takes a position on your back, one knee's on the mat, one knee's behind you, hand across the belly, hand on the elbow, referee blows the whistle, you start from there. You can take the top position or the bottom position, or you can choose to start on your feet neutral. Third period comes, the other guy gets his choice. If it ends in a draw, it goes to a fourth period, 1 minute overtime, and then it goes into sudden death. Basically, you get 30 seconds. Each man gets a choice, top or bottom. You either have to score, the other guy gets the chance to score. If he doesn't score, you win. If he scores and it's still tied, you go to a sudden death. If you're on bottom, you're on top, he's on top. If you get up, get away, you win the match. If he keeps you from getting away, he wins the match.
So it sounds like for anyone who might, I can keep up with this. So
Yeah.
far, I'm there. I'm following everything you just said. I understand what you're saying. For non-grapplers, um, from my, and even like for someone, and again, I don't want to go. I don't want to take up too much time talking about myself, but like I come more from jiu-jitsu submission grappling background. So like
Yeah.
looking what you're talking about though, it sounds like 6 to 7.5 minutes of non-stop go.
Oh,
Because
it's
you
a
can't,
grind.
you like you
Yes.
said, you can't stop, you can't stall, which is in jiu-jitsu. That's all. Well, they'll call you on it a little bit. And I did some catch wrestling out here, and they'll call you out if you start stalling, and they'll make you, if you do too much stalling, they'll stand you back up. And
Yeah.
the judges, the point system isn't as sophisticated. I'll just put it that way, because these guys are
Right.
just like they're mostly MMA guys, and they're. I'm still very. I have a lot of questions about how their point system works and whether there is one. But so
Yeah.
the point system sounds a lot more sophisticated. So you actually have a certain amount of points. You're racking points. I'm guessing because you have to have 15 points over your opponent, there isn't a lot of matches unless it's like a complete mismatch. There isn't a lot of matches. It sounds like it's close the whole time. You're fighting for those points and you're keeping those points together. It's just like every time you slow down, you get penalized. So these two guys are just moving, or the two women or whoever the players are,
Yeah.
they're just going for
Well,
these
I
three
mean,
rounds for 2 minutes at
yeah.
a time.
You can
Does that
have
sum it up?
two really good wrestlers in there, but if you've got one guy that's, say, for instance, is really good at tilting, he gets a really tight lock, a gut wrench and a wing, pins an arm, and he's able to keep turning you to your back and getting a 5 count. I mean, he gets a 2 point takedown, he gets exposure points, he gets 3 points. He might change it, he might go the other way. Right now, the way the rules, it's like you can't keep turning a guy. You actually have to break the move, go to a different move to score another point. But if he can keep turning you to his back, he can rack up 15 points in 30 seconds. And you might have another guy that's really good at just doing takedowns and cutting loose and take you down, take you to their back, score 2, score 4, let you back up, take you down again. That guy can score quick. A good
Okay.
match is probably going to be, you guys are going to kick each other's butt for 6.5 minutes or more, 6 to 7 minutes, and just be, it might wind up a 2-1 match. It might wind up a 3-1. It might wind up a 3 to, it's
So
a good match is going to be close.
on average, how long do these matches? For you coach them, so on average, how long do you think these things last? Have you seen? Like if you had
Well,
to
like I
throw
said, it
some
depends. If the guys are both, if it's an equal match and they're banging in each other, I've had matches go like where it came down to like you had to get away or you got to get up. I've had guys win by, doing that. And once you get into like double overtime, you've now been beating on each other for close to 10 minutes.
Oh, jeez.
And you're exhausted. You got 7 minutes of just grinding takedowns, all that. Then you got another minute, trying to ride a guy and he's cutting away. And if he gets out, then you got to try and take him down. And then he gets a chance to do it to you. And then if it's still tied, you got to go that last, 30-second round. You got 30 seconds to get away or you don't. And you either win or lose in that 30 seconds.
And each tournament, how many matches do you think a person has?
Well, if you go to an open tournament and there's no CIF rules, you can wrestle. It doesn't matter. You can wrestle 8 or 10 matches a day.
Jesus.
If you have to. Like some of these bigger tournaments, like the Super 32s, which is back east. If you go to like the Freak Show here in Las Vegas, you might be in a 64-man bracket.
Okay.
So you're going to be wrestling for 8-10 hours, and you might wrestle anywhere from. You might wrestle 3 or 4 matches, depending on how many in your weight group, but you might wrestle 6 or 7 matches that day, and then you got to make it to day 2.
Wow. So you got about at least, yeah. So okay. So anybody doing some quick math, you're going to be doing a lot of wrestling. All right.
Yeah.
So sorry to everyone for my side journey into the rules of folk style wrestling, but I think it's cool because like I'm going through this because we're gonna go back to Larry's story. This is what Larry did before he ended up finding us in Kajukenbo. So far in our story, we have Tang Sudo. We have a lot of wrestling. We have folk style wrestling, freestyle wrestling. Now we know what folk style wrestling is for those of you who didn't know. And you briefly brushed through your 20s, and then you jumped into when your kids were born. I know you had a turnaround in your life. And
Yeah.
I'm not gonna go into the details of this,
Yeah.
but
There's a reason there wasn't much going on between the 20s and the 30s.
but I will say that I think what I find so amazing about your story is that turnaround. Like, you had a rough patch, you pulled through. In your 30s, you got it all back together again, and you are who you are now, which is,
Yeah.
I think I wish more young men would know about that, because a lot of people that have a hard time in their 20s, for whatever reason, sometimes they don't see an exit. They think it's just that's going to be the rest of their life, and for
Well,
some
I
it,
had
and
two
for some it
kids, and you
is.
forget I had two kids. You forget I was a single father for two kids. I raised two kids on my own from ages of 3 and 4.
How old were you when that
So
happened? How old were you?
I was in my early 30s.
Early 30s. So there you go, single dad at early 30s, right? And you got through it.
Yep.
You start coaching wrestling, and you end up in Kajukenbo. So I guess my question that I always ask everyone, because at this point, it's not like you came in fresh, you did Kajukenbo all your life. Some guys do have that. I don't have that, but some guys that I interview have that. What was your impression of Kajukenbo as you came in?
Uh, well, the very first class I ever took, you remember it was I had not really trained in a studio in, geez, 25 years maybe. Um, and I walked out of there, and of course, I had met Ronnie, and at the time I'd also met Sifu Mike. We all worked together way back in the day. That's how we met each other at Home Depot. And the first time I came into that class, I literally walked out of there that day after training with all you guys, feeling like, where was Kajukenbo my whole life? Like, why didn't I find this 30 years ago when I was a young guy? It was one of those epiphany moments where you feel like, man, what might this have changed in my life? Not that I would ever change anything, because I'm happy where I went. I'm happy where I came from. There's that part. Would I change a lot? Probably. Would I want to? Probably not, because I would not be who I am today. But I literally, from the minute that first day in that first class, I had wished I had found Kajukenbo, like as I said, way back in the 70s. I would have never left it.
And so you came, and like I said, you came in, you already came in with some striking, you came in with some grappling. What in particular about Kajukenbo stood out to you? Because you already were exposed to Tang Sudo, you were exposed to Taekwondo, and you were also a lot of wrestling. So what exactly, when you were looking at Kajukenbo specifically, kind of stood out to you as, oh, this is what I like, and this is why I like it?
It was the Ohana feeling, the family feeling. Like literally from the first day, and I had known you guys for a while, but I decided Corey had actually been training with Sifu Andrew Castillo's son a little bit, because his son Zeke was one of Professor Ronnie's students at the time. So Corey had mentioned wanting to train, and I knew that I had been wanting to get back into training. And, I had always told Ronnie, I'd like to get back into training. So there was finally that moment where, you know what? I remember telling him, I'm like, hey, dude, I'm coming to class tonight. He was like, okay. And I remember when we started training and we were sitting there and we were doing our pre-class stretching, and I remember Ronnie was giggling because he could not believe, like, Larry was in his class. Like, he was looking at me in the back and we're stretching out. And he's like, oh my God, I cannot believe Larry Gordon is training in my class.
I remember him saying that.
Remember that? And from that moment on, dude, it's been, it's probably been one of the greatest Well, it is one of the greatest things in my life. It's one of those few times in my life I wish I would have found something sooner.
And what I think is cool, and I know I'm just I hate to do this because I feel like I'm not tooting my own horn, but since you're all part of my like direct Ohana, I feel like it's like I'm bragging about my family, right? Like, oh yeah, my dad
Right.
can beat up your dad, that kind of thing. So like I'm trying to avoid that. But what I thought was really cool, when you came in, and this is something I love about Kajukenbo, is you came in as a white belt, but we already knew your background in wrestling. We already knew, because you were already kind of part of our circle because of your son. So we already knew where you came from. And I think by this, it was less than a month where I can't remember the timeline. Maybe you remember the timeline better than I do, but I know it was fairly shortly after you joined. And I remember seafood professor, whichever one
Right.
you want to call it, however you know him as. I know Ronnie Sagiri told me. He said, "Hey, I'm gonna bring in Larry's a wrestling coach. We're gonna have him do grappling. We're gonna be going over grappling. He knows a lot of grappling, and he's like, I can't wait to have him in here and start having him work some grappling with you guys." That was the first thing he said. I don't know when he brought that to you, but he brought that to me right away. And I was like, yes,
Right.
that's I was like, all right, cool. I can't wait for that. And it was shortly after you were a white belt, right? So I know,
Mhm.
like I know other styles, the way they work. Like for example, let's just use Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as an example. If you go into a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu place, they can care less about your background. No, some places might. I'm not going to make a generalized statement, but most places can care less about what experience you had before you got there, and they're going to start you from the very beginning, and they're not really going to ask you questions about helping out or anything until you've gone through their system a little longer.
Yeah.
But we already knew you and we knew your background. So we, like, the way it works in Kajukenbo is if someone has a talent and they're talented in an area, like in your case, you already had a lot of expertise in grappling, we won't hesitate to bring that person in and immediately start sharing that information with the rest of the class. We're not,
Yeah.
even though you were a white belt, they said he's a white, and he used to say that. "Oh, he's a white belt in Kajukenbo, but he's a black belt in wrestling if there was such a thing."
If there was such a thing, that's
Yeah,
exactly right. Yeah.
so and that's how we work. Like, we already had mad respect for you from your grappling background, and I still to this day call you coach, because like all the wrestling that I learned was from you. Later it turned
Yeah.
into what it is now. I'll never forget the face a wrestling coach gave me in China when I said, he asked me, "So you have," I went into a wrestling class for the first time because I never did wrestling, right? We always did wrestling. We always did the wrestling within a Kajukenbo context. So you were always like, all right, if you do punch number one this way, you can go for a single leg here, you can go for a double leg here, and then you can, and then we go, okay, cool, then we can do a ground and pound. We'd immediately grab what you had for your wrestling, and immediately be like, okay, and then I can go do this, and I can do that, I can stomp him on the head, I can do these moves. And when I tried to explain this to a guy who never did Kajukenbo, who only did wrestling, he looked at me, he gave me this weird look, and I was like, he's like, "That's not wrestling." I'm like, that the guy who taught me was
So
a wrestler.
in lies the problem again, too. I'm a folk style coach with freestyle and Greco-Roman some background, but in Japan, they only wrestle freestyle.
Oh, that was in China. So that guy was an American. That guy was an American wrestling coach in China. He
Uh-huh.
trained. I forgot who he worked with. I think it was either Michael Bisping. He trained with some UFC fighters out in Canada, and he was.
Uh-huh.
By the time I came, well, by the time he met me, and he didn't know who I was, and he was just asking me my background. Like, he was trying to gauge me. He was
Yeah.
trying to gauge me before the wrestling class, and I got destroyed in the wrestling class because I never wrestled. Like,
Yeah.
I only did
Yeah.
MMA.
You'd only been a few classes, like some basics, you know?
Yeah, we went over some basics. I did a lot of jujitsu at that point, but I never really did wrestling. I only did stuff to use it immediately for MMA. So
Yeah.
when we were done, he was kind of like, but then later we did the MMA class. He's like, "Oh, okay." So like, but for during the wrestling class, he's like, "I don't." You said you did I never. I said, I told him I never did wrestling. I'm telling you, we had a wrestling coach that came into our Kajukenbo class, and we did wrestling for the street. And he was like, and he just like, "I don't get it. I've never heard of that." That's where his
Well,
words. And I was like, "Oh, You heard it here first, I guess.
Well, you guys know, and many of your guests, I've heard everybody refer to it. And Sijo back in the day, he wanted that Kajukenbo. He doesn't want it to be any one thing. It's about growing and taking it somewhere else, and making it your own. And that day that Professor Ronnie asked me if I would like start showing some of that stuff. He mentioned that, like, because the thing about Kajukenbo is it's not a stagnant art. It's an art that is meant to grow. And everybody, no matter what system you come from or who your instructors are, everybody has done something to change to make it their own, you know. So that was kind of where we were at.
So going back to our timeline here, you found Kajukenbo, you start training in Kajukenbo. Let's go towards some key moments for you in Kajukenbo. When did you, because there's a point, and maybe you can answer this better than I can. What point when you started doing Kajukenbo were you like, I want to be a black belt? Like, this is something that I want to do. This is something I'm going to keep doing, and this is something I'm never going to stop doing. I know you're kind of hinting towards it right now in your first answer earlier, but I'm just going to clarify it. You can maybe clarify that some more. When did you decide this is what I want to do? This is what I want to teach. This is part of what I want to be.
Well, I decided, like, literally that, like I said, that first time, after the first class, that Kajukenbo was where I was going to stay. I never really put it in my head like I wanted to be a black belt. I just knew I was always going to train. I was always going to be part of, our Ohana with Professor Ronnie and Sifu Mike and, Sifu Simon, yourself, everybody that we've come to train with over the years. And that was just going to be part of my life. And I just I took the program, the promotions as we went along. When Professor said, I'm going to test you, I said, okay. But remember too, I hit that point where I got my brown belt, in a couple of years. And then I was the gatekeeper of the brown belts, literally, like, with the exception of Sifu Mike and Sifu Simon, and those black belts before, even we had to fight for you guys to get, like, I basically all of Professor Ronnie's black belts from the time I became a brown belt, had to fight me to get their brown belt or their black belt. Like, literally, I had, there's like Adam and Sifu Alicia, and those kids were yellow belts and white belts when I came through, and most of them had to fight me to get to their black belt. And I was a black belt for 10 years. I mean, excuse me, I was a brown belt for 10 years before finally in 2018, Professor Ronnie promoted me, which was a complete surprise to me. And that was coming back. That was right after COVID, and we had that big gathering down there at Westside Park in your old neighborhood, and we had guys from all over Washington and Mexico, and the Grandmaster Kenji came down, who, by the way, I have, like, is just one of them. He's one of the guys. He and Grandmaster Gary are just two of the most amazing guys that I've ever met. And I will, like, that's also one of the things that I find so amazing about Kajukenbo, or the people I've met, over the years. But yeah, back to my brown belt. I was literally the brown belt that everybody had to fight to get their black belt for 10 years,
And he said, yeah, Professor Roddy, using his new title, he would say, like, you got to get through Larry. He's the wrestler. You got to prove to us that you can get past the wrestler.
Yeah. I mean, I was the gatekeeper. I was the gatekeeper brown belt from like 2009 until 2018 when I finally got promoted.
And then for all my students that are watching this, whenever I talk about the time I fought a wrestler and the wrestlers, I'm talking about Larry and his sons. I'll just say it out. So if you're wondering, because I got a lot of stories about when yeah, this one time I was fighting a wrestler, I did this. This one time I was like, yeah, I'm talking about Larry and his sons. Just,
Yeah.
well, right now, any of my students are laughing at that statement because a lot of stories just hit them.
Yeah.
So, so Larry, what was your black belt test? Because I wasn't there. I was overseas. So what was your black belt? Wow, I can't
Well,
get that out. Hold on a second. What was your black belt test like?
so my black belt test was never really the test like you guys had to go through. Which is why it was such a surprise to me, because we had you'll remember Professor Ronnie when he got sick with CIDP. I had competed, for many years in Vegas as a brown belt, and in many of those cases, I was in the black belt division. Um, I had placed at many tournaments. I'd won a few times. But I was always there. We went to, a few other tournaments. I was still grappling, even when I was almost 60. And then Professor Ronnie, it's pretty crazy because in what was it, 2016 or 17, at the Gathering of Champions, Professor Angie Abad's tournament, Ronnie and I competed together at that tournament, and he took grand champion in weapons. I think I took third place at that tournament, and he was competing with a numb foot. And which we just kind of figured it was a pinched nerve or whatnot. And of course, as everybody that follows Professor Ronnie, and I'm pretty sure the majority of the Kajukenbo, the family worldwide, has at some point followed Professor Ronnie's journey from that point on. We competed in October, and by February, he was paralyzed from the neck down. And then, of course, it was, they were trying to figure out what was wrong. Once they figured out what was wrong, get him on the treatments. And then once the treatments were working, it was getting him into rehab and getting him, he basically had to learn how to eat, how to walk, how to talk, how to, stand. Everybody's like, basically he was an infant, and he had to learn all that stuff all over again. And he came to me and he said, because as soon as he started his rehab, they were like, he wanted everything done. He wanted it back now, and he wasn't going to stop. And he remembered that from when I had my ACL reconstruction, I was the same way. I'd go into rehab and I would push so hard that I'd make great progresses ahead, and then I would fall back because I'd push too hard. And then I would have to take time off and then start over again. So he came to me and he said, I need somebody that I know can piss me off, but still push me no matter how mad I get. And he said, I need you to start coming with me to rehab. And so at the time I was working nights at Home Depot, where we both worked. I was working days at the high school where I coach and where I work with the special needs kids. I basically told them that for the next however long it took, I was going to need Thursdays off. And I proceeded to spend the next 2 years almost every Thursday. And even some Tuesdays, because Ronnie, I believe he went Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I went to all of Ronnie's rehabilitation classes, or his rehabilitation sessions with him. Drove him there. Then when he started getting better, I would push him, then make him drive himself there, even though that was kind of scary there the first few times, because he still doesn't have feeling in his feet, but he can move his foot. So I'm like, well, that's good. It'll teach you to get to the brake quicker. So So anyway, we spent 2.5, almost 3 years rehabbing that, and we got him from, literally almost dying to the time we had the reunion seminar that we had at Westside Park. And he had, like I said, Grandmaster Rick came down. We had Alfredo Aguirre from Washington. We had Lou Farallon from Washington at the time. Rest in peace. He was still around. We had Sifu Francisco came up from Mexico. It was just an amazing gathering, and unbeknownst to me, he had already set it up that was going to be my black belt promotion. So the actual test, the way he put it is, he has tested like many times over the years. Every time I've told him to compete, he's competed. I have won in weapons. I have won in forms. I had won in self-defense. I'd won in fighting. He said, so as far as he was concerned, I'd already done the test. And then he said, of course, what he did for me, which much of it was documented on his Facebook through those 2.5 years. He was always posting, and most everybody will remember the always improving. Was he and I basically getting him back, pushing him, getting him back to his feet again. So at that 2018 reunion, like I said, it was 2008? Yeah, it was 2018, and actually it was right before COVID. He wanted to have the thing to welcome himself back, because we had him on his feet. He was using a cane by that time. And anyway, he surprised me with a black belt promotion in front of many of the grandmasters and many of the Kajukenbo royalty from all over, the West Coast, some from the East, from the Midwest, Mexico. It was an amazing thing, and I never expected to get promoted. I honestly felt like I would be the black belt forever, or that I figured I'd be the brown belt forever. So, and since then, now I have, I got my first degree back with you in December, and I will just continue to move forward from there.
Someone was just posting this in the Kajukenbo training page. For anybody watching who wants to, oh, by the way, this is not the Kajukenbo podcast. People have been saying that. It's not. It's Social Agile podcast. I have a lot of Kajukenbo guys on here, but so yeah, if you want to check out some stuff, Kajukenbo training page. If you're interested more about Kajukenbo, a lot of Kajukenbo guys are there. Kajukenbo Pit Ohana page, some places to check out. Someone was asking about black belt tests on the page, and I feel that there's two types of tests. There's the formal test, like the kind that I had to take, where you do there's like a certain program, certain amount of techniques, certain amount of things you got to do. But then there's a second type of test that I've seen people go through, and I've put people through as well, where the person, because really it's about showing dedication to the art and knowing that, because the last thing you want to do as someone who's testing someone is give someone a black belt who's going to stop training. That's like our nightmare. Okay, this person's been training for whatever X amount of years, they're really good. Then they get their black belt and they quit for whatever reason. They stop training for whatever reason. So that's always for us instructors, that's something we're always worried about. So really, if you look at what the black belt's supposed to mean, it's supposed to mean that this is someone that's going to be doing this for the rest of their life. And some people go through a formal test, and then some people like you, it's just another day in the office. Yeah. It's not like you were slacking during training, right? There's some people that need that clear goal. And I was saying that, like, some people need that clear goal, like, hey, you need to accomplish X, Y, Z to go to the next step, and they need that. But you were going at 100 miles per hour as a white belt from day one.
Yeah.
From day one. There was never a day you came in, you were slacking. That was not what was happening ever. So for you, you fall into that second category. I'll say it. You fall into that second category, guys, that every time you came in, you were always 100% on the mats. There was never a time you came in at, how old are you, Larry? I know we were calling you old, but that was
Back
we were
when
calling you old. We were calling you old 15 years ago.
well, let's just put it this way. I just turned 63 about 2 weeks ago. So
So yeah, I think
you do the math. I'm not going to do the math.
You were getting close to or in your 50s.
Yes.
If I remember correctly, you were up there in your 40s. I remember every time I'd spar you, since I already got before you came in, it was a little before you came in. Were you there when I broke that guy's nose? And I'm not going to mention his name, so that doesn't feel embarrassed. Were you
The
there when I
guy,
broke that guy's nose? When I gave him a compound fracture and
was
his bone was
that
sticking out?
uh
That
the
was
guy,
my
Bob?
that's the same thing.
Kudos to Bob.
Shout out to Bob. Sorry, Bob. Trying to avoid.
Yeah, I was there for that one.
Okay, so if you were there for that, it was a little before that happened that that Sifu was always warning me, professor now, about excessive contact. He was like, I know you can fight. I want you to show me control. So a lot of my tests were not based on how hard I could go. It was how hard could you go without hurting the person that you're sparring with. And but every time I'd spar with you, he'd always be like, you still I know
He was always telling us both that.
This is gonna be tricky. Yeah, he was always telling both of us because you'd come in, he'd tell me go light, and then you'd come in with an overhand pat. I'm like, light.
Yeah, no, there was no, yeah, I was like, I figured, hey, I didn't break your bones, so that was light. And it's still to that day, like they're always telling everybody when we just texted when we tested Alexis, and I was the first one she had to fight, and Adria pulled her aside. Sibak Adria pulled her aside and said, she goes, "Don't worry, you're getting the hardest one first, so you get through him, and the rest is easy." So, because they always say, like, I always feel like I hold back a little bit, but they always say it's like, God, you're always going so hard,
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, so yeah, it's you're kind of a 2-gear guy. The 1-gear guy is what Hackelman calls him, like a 1-gear guy. You got 1 gear,
yeah,
and
fast
that's
and
go.
stop.
That's go.
Yeah.
That's go.
Yep. Yeah.
So yeah. Well, brother, we are getting toward the end of the podcast. Before we wrap up, though, I just want to thank you very much for coming on the show. He's your family, and I'm glad you finally came out here. And for those of you who enjoyed the show, I'm gonna have Larry come back. I've been wanting Larry to come out here for a while now, but he's a busy guy, coaching, wrestling, teaching Kajukenbo classes, taking care of your family. So I get it. But I do want to have Larry come back so we could talk. So for those of you that enjoyed the grappling section, I'd love to have him come back and really go into a deep dive in grappling and wrestling.
I'd love to do that because this was kind of like I feel like after seeing some of your podcasts, I feel like we just kind of went down memory lane.
Yeah,
which was cool. Like, but
I love doing that though. So that now anybody who in the future, when we do go into a topic, if we do just a topic, if they're like, who's this guy? I'll always refer, hey, you can find out who he is if you watch this episode.
Right.
This episode's about Larry Gordon, how you got into Kajukenbo and how you mixed it up. And I can attest, he did. He mixed it up. And congratulations again on both promotions. The second one I was there, but the first one I wasn't. So congratulations on that.
Thank you very much.
Is there any shout outs, any promotional stuff you want to say before we go?
I'm gonna make it just in general to our entire Kajukenbo Ohana. I mean, I appreciate and am thankful for everybody I've met in my journey. I've got a lot of people that I've met through wrestling, but I honestly, my Kajukenbo Ohana with all of you and everybody that that I've met over the years is just an amazing, my life is so much richer since Kajukenbo. And I just want to shout out to anybody and everybody that I've ever met and to those that I haven't, because even if we haven't met them, I mean, they're still all part of our Ohana. So it's an amazing part to be. It's an amazing something to be part of.
Well, with that being said, this is the Social Jello with Angelo podcast. Subscribe and share with your friends, especially if you're Kajukenbo and you like what you heard. Share with your friends. This is not the Kajukenbo podcast. I'll keep saying that. Although people don't believe me anymore when I say that. Yeah, but yeah, if you like what you saw, share with your friends. And I try to release at least two to three of these a month. Lately it's been every week, but I always make a disclaimer. It's supposed to be one a month. It's just I've been recording more than usual. All right. Catch y'all next time.
Wow.